Now, you're welcome back. Very happy to say Rob Harris joins us on the line. He is the global sports correspondent for Associated Press. Rob, hello.
Hello, good to see you.
Great to have you on. So we've been meaning to do a piece on Arsene Wenger and his biennial World Cup idea for some time. Arsene Wenger these days, of course, is FIFA's chief of global football development. And so he wants biennial tournament. Really, he launched this maybe 3-4 weeks ago. In the main, I would think, to raised eyebrows and negativity from various stakeholders in the game. But then, to be fair, not universal slamming of his ideas either. So, in so much as you can, give us the nuts and bolts here, what Wenger is proposing.
Yeah, what a complicated process this is in the sense of how we've reached the point where FIFA seems on the verge of, in UEFA's words, really railroading through biennial World Cups. And this was an idea that started with the FIFA president, Gianni Infantino. It was then nominally proposed at the FIFA Congress in May by the Saudi Arabian Federation to be put forward for approval of a feasibility study, which of course went through by more than 160 of the 211 FIFA member associations, many of course who never get to go to a World Cup, many who are very supportive always of the FIFA president. And then Wenger was asked by Infantino and the organisation to lead the study into biennial World Cups to try to also win support for it. We then reached the point in early September where Wenger lays out his plans initially in an interview with L'Equipe, then in the days later with more of us journalists as well. And it becomes clear that Arsene Wenger wants a World Cup every 2 years for men. What's very clear at that point is they hadn't even really seemed to factor in the impact on the women's game or even a women's World Cup every 2 years as well. And we sort of go through the month of September and we've had opposition from UEFA, the European Club Association, European Leagues Organisation, all about the detrimental impact on the game of the shake-up with biennial World Cups, with potentially only 2 international windows now, one for the June-July tournament, another for October and November, where you'd play the other fixtures like qualifiers for the national teams. And it was only last Thursday that all the 211 member associations got a chance to hear the presentation themselves from Wenger and FIFA, even though that was like 3 weeks after we'd got it. So you can see now why, you know, there is some unease, particularly around the likes of UEFA, about their belief that they've not even been properly consulted on this, while FIFA are trying to push through plans that would overhaul football. And you've got CONMEBOL in South America also opposed to these plans. Intriguingly, they themselves in 2018 proposed this themselves, World Cup every 2 years, but since then they've moved away from them as they've got closer aligned to UEFA.
So a couple of questions jump to mind. I suppose before we get too into the weeds of this idea, it'd be nice to get an idea for how likely it is to come to pass. Like Wenger was talking about how we could have this up and running by World Cup 2028, and I suppose in this neck of the woods it would be World Cup in 28, the Euros in 29, World Cup in 30, Euros 31, and on we go forevermore. So I guess a couple of questions. One, how likely is it to pass at FIFA Congress next May, which is ultimately, I think, where this thing may be voted on? And if FIFA pass it at their Congress next May, does that mean world football at large just has to go along with it? Like UEFA hate this and the various club leagues hate this, but is there anything they can do if FIFA voted through?
Well, the question is, do UEFA go through with their threat of a boycott? They've said that actually the teams wouldn't take part in a World Cup, but we've already had France saying that they're yet to decide either way. Germany and Portugal have come out against World Cup every 2 years. England's been cautious at this stage, even though the FA's women's division has come out against the plans because of the impact on the women's game, particularly because if you did have a World Cup every 2 years and a continental championship in the alternate years, then no longer would there be the odd numbers years, the preserve of women's tournaments in those summers with the women's Euros, for instance, and also the World Cup. So it really encroach into that territory. But the decision could come even sooner than May, because FIFA could hold a meeting in December to get approval for this. And then that would really accelerate the sense of the opposition from UEFA. But we have gone through some of this before. In 2019, in particular, UEFA were opposing the Club World Cup expansion plans by FIFA. Then they went and accepted them on the basis of 8 rather than 12 European teams. And they've been making all sorts of threats against FIFA on this. So there is precedent for the bark being pretty loud from UEFA, but then in reality, they aren't quite as tough. So it's interesting to see how then this does unfold, because FIFA could seemingly get this through from a vote of its membership, because there is that widespread support from across Africa. We sense from other parts of Asia as well, where FIFA's already garnered support. But there are so many questions just over the process and how they've reached this point. The thing is, FIFA does need some sort of agreement on the international match calendar. It expires for women in 2023, for men in 2024. So a new calendar is needed, and the calendar is what mandates clubs to release players to international duty. It sets in stone all those windows through the year when you're meant to have qualifiers or tournaments. So it's really crucial for the running of the global game between the international part of football and the club part.
Yeah. The damage it would do to the women's game notwithstanding for a moment, because I think actually that could become a bigger and bigger issue for FIFA to explain away, and rightly so. But Arsene Wenger's a very serious man. Listening to his many press conferences over 20 years at Arsenal was generally one of the more interesting ways to spend 15 minutes if you were forced to go through managerial press conferences. So I think when it was Wenger at the forefront here, a lot of people would have said, okay, well, let's stop and listen to what he has to say. There are some fair points in this. Like, I think the reality is the international calendar does need to be redefined. At the moment, as you mentioned earlier on, we have international windows in September, then we go again in October, which we're in at the moment, then there'll be another in November, then in March. It's very dragged out, it's incredibly dull, and then in June there are either friendlies or different countries get together and organise tournaments of their own, and there's lots of travel. So in terms of player welfare, there's a huge amount of travel there. Like, we often again think of, well, Irish players nipping back on the flight from Heathrow or from Manchester, but I mean South American players playing in European leagues having to trek over 15-20 hour flight, come back a few days later, play a Premier League game, do it all again in November, do it all again in March, is unsustainable in many ways, not to mention the environment, if that increasingly is going to become an issue as well. So I have to say, there is something in the idea of almost this mini international tournament he's proposing. So instead of all these international windows, all the interruptions to, say, the Premier League, which everybody's enjoying, in October you have 4 teams, a group in effect. You'd have a maximum of 7 matches depending on playoffs and everything else. And that would be how you would qualify for the major tournament the following summer. And you could imagine a real festival excitement about that in winter, and a point of difference as opposed to watching yet another, international qualifier away to Georgia. Or we have Azerbaijan this Saturday, which I'm looking forward to and everything, Rob. But I think the idea of the 4-team group and a sense of festival might be better. So whatever about the every 2 years notion for a moment, there is something, I would say, in Wenger's point that the international calendar at the moment doesn't really work or excite many people.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's trying to get more meaningful games, remove some of those less meaningful ones. I mean, I'm speaking to you actually from Twickenham, bit of rugby perspective on all this, which is the fact is they have the October for the autumn internationals, obviously February, March for the Six Nations, and then, we've got in June as well for those games as well, those tests. So, the 3 clearer blocks of games, and maybe that is something that works better, because I think for now, having games in September, then October, then November, it's so disjointed, going away on international duty, going back to your clubs as well, then returning again. It could be more cohesive to actually get a block of games together. Certainly the leagues, though, don't want sort of a month off between October and November where they lose completely all their games, and disruption it would cause as well to something like the Champions League as well. Perhaps a smaller window in October, then another in March makes sense. Another reason is, imagine you're a player and you don't make the squad in October for those games. Well, the next squad, this is only the tournament one in June. So you might have missed your chance to break into the squad if you've done particularly well, around the turn of the year, but a manager doesn't want to take the risk in terms of selecting you yet for the national team. The March window does obviously allow that now, that final chance to maybe look at some new players before a tournament in the summer. So perhaps having an October, November window, a March window, and the summer does work. So that's that part of the reconfiguration. Wenger's talking about obviously removing those less meaningful games. At the same time, he told the meeting, I'm told, last week of the FAs that he might consider a secondary World Cup for those teams that don't qualify for the main World Cup, to give them games. So that would obviously create games that aren't as commercially appealing, particularly if it's the same time as the main World Cup. Well, how attractive would they be to fans to even watch on television? So it creates more infrastructure challenges as well. You've got to find venues for all these. So it's often about expansionism. And the sense is from some, it's about FIFA President Gianni Infantino wanting to be more involved in the global game. As it stands now, in part because of the pandemic, he's not been able to oversee a main FIFA World Cup since the Women's World Cup 2019. This plan, if it was approved, would see a FIFA World Cup every single year, either men's one year or women the next year. And that will suddenly place FIFA right at the heart of the football calendar every year, increase the power and status of FIFA as well, and of Infantino. So, that's been one of the things. And obviously, the consultation has brought out so many intriguing thoughts as well. The fact is so many former players are being wheeled out by FIFA on in-house videos stating the case for changes to the international match calendar that ultimately lead to a World Cup every 2 years. It's worth checking out. But last week on CBS on their Champions League coverage, Peter Schmeichel was in the studio and he was put up for a FIFA press conference a few weeks ago stating the FIFA case. And he was challenged in the studio by Thierry Henry and Jamie Carragher, both saying, why are FIFA consulting us as retired players? We're not the ones there anymore. Why aren't we hearing from them speaking to the main players who are still around? And Carragher also pointed out that Wenger first approached him and he thinks he wasn't asked back for any more talks because he wasn't supportive enough.
Right, okay. Well, I think, look, all of these former players coming out and talking on FIFA's behalf should have a ticker at the bottom of the screen saying how much they've been paid for their time here, because
it's not necessarily even about how much they've been paid or not. It's actually about partly the lifestyle. They get taken to the FIFA events, they get flown out to Qatar, which might make them naturally more supportive and receptive. It gives them this role within the game still as well. And, that's what's ringing alarm bells, and quite literally around me here.
Well, look, if you need to run at any stage there, I mean, don't put your life in danger for us at any stage. There was a question there. Oh, yeah, so that was fascinating that you said Wenger only got around to talking to various leagues and various stakeholders maybe 3-4 weeks after. Do you have to go?
I might have to, yes, unfortunately. I'm just trying to, yes.
Trying to work out if your life is in danger here or not.
Yeah. It might be an actual fire alarm, which is you might have a livelier scene. I can try talking to you still while walking. If you want to still, as I'm packing up, I can continue talking to you.
No. We wouldn't do that to you, just on the rare occasion where there might be something serious. Listen, Rob Harris wouldn't like to start to make you stay in these circumstances.
It has stopped.
It has stopped. Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't want that on my conscience driving home, Rob. So it was fascinating. You were talking there that Wenger had taken a while to get around to talk to various serious enough stakeholders, various leagues and FAs, because a couple of weeks ago when this was all first launched, I remember listening to Gary Neville's podcast, and Martin Tyler asked him about this, and I was, as you would, Rob, I was looking forward to full-on Neville rant and a European Super League-esque slapdown of this, and it was very interesting. He said, I can't remember, did he say Wenger specifically, but he said, look, I've been briefed by it. They sat us down, they made the presentation to us, and that suggested a degree of smarts on Wenger's part and on FIFA's part, that actually they obviously have picked out certain people long ahead of the FAs to get on board, and Neville, to be fair, was saying, look, I can definitely see certain plus points here. He was admittedly saying, look, I'm sitting on the fence a touch, but I'm not shooting this down necessarily. There is some good stuff in this. So even though he hasn't spoken to the FAs until quite recently, Wenger was doing some politicking somewhere along the line.
Yeah, for sure. He's sort of trying to win the backing of former players in particular. And perhaps it's so many faults in the process that have caused the questions over this, because, if it started perhaps last year by saying, let's look at the new international match calendar, how should it look, looked at the various options, and then said, this is what we've had back, now let's look at the feasibility of a biennial World Cup. Instead, they've come back and said, they've started from the point of saying we want a biennial World Cup, and now trying to prove the case backwards. And perhaps that's what's led to the questions over the the process that they're going about this, and the fact the women's game is clearly appearing to be secondary, the fact they've only brought in Jill Ellis more recently, the former US World Cup winning coach, to look at the women's game, whereas Wenger has been looking at the men's game for much longer.
Yeah. Personal question. Would you like a World Cup every 2 years? Do you feel it would diminish it in your eyes, or would you think, oh, look, I watch and enjoy Champions League every year, why not?
Well, it does seem it will diminish it, I think, having a World Cup every 2 years. Already now, the Champions League group stage does have a bit of luster taken from it. Yes, we see the shocks with Sheriff beating Real Madrid, but we still think there's time for Real Madrid to recover. But if we just point out some of the inconsistencies, the European Club Association are one of those groups opposing these plans. They are adding another 4 games to the group stage from 2024, from 6 to 10 games, which many have said actually will diminish the Champions League in some way. So they've looked to add games while they talk about the impact on player workload on this bigger World Cup more often, because of course the World Cup is jumping to 48 teams as well from 2026, and not only every 2 years, but a 48-team men's World Cup as well.
Yeah, ultimately that's the point, isn't it, Rob? We're just seeing every organisation try and cram in more and more games and take up more and more real estate. That's what's happening at the moment. There's a proper tension, certainly between UEFA and FIFA and beyond.
There is, absolutely. It's the battleground over who controls football. And we just see that with UEFA and Common Ball have linked up to hold these games between the champions of the confederations. The fact we're going to have a game between Argentina next year and Italy, the first of these games. And the fact UEFA and Common Ball are opening an office even together in London as well. So it just shows like a rival power faction building, all in the battle to control football.
How likely do you think FIFA are then to get this across the line?
It's looking like they could do. Really, it depends on, do the opponents really take it to the brink? They really carry out their threats and say they will boycott a World Cup? What do UEFA do to stop this? But it does have that momentum behind it now.
Okay. One last question, separate issue. Speaking of FIFA, I saw for the first time on Sunday they offered direct encouragement for footballers to get vaccinated. This was on Sunday, so it was the first clear statement of its kind from FIFA. We encourage COVID-19 vaccinations and endorse the WHO's position. Safe, fair, equitable access is critical in all countries. Players should not receive priority access to vaccines. So, look, the Premier League has an issue on its hand and many leagues beyond. What's your understanding of the hesitancy in dressing rooms the world over, not least in England and the Premier League?
Well, I'm here at the Leaders in Sport conference, so it's interesting talking to club officials around here, and you get that real sense from them of how that hesitancy has grown. You've got players who may be thinking on religious grounds. Some have said that, they might have a resistance to vaccines, not something that, we hear from the World Health Organization. But perhaps there's been an ability for the disinformation to grow over the months in the wait for players to be able to get the vaccines, because obviously there are so many saying they shouldn't be jumping the queue and getting them, say, around March time or April, ahead of those who are older and more vulnerable as well. And I think we've also seen players thinking, well, does it really affect me? I'm not in the at-risk group if you're in the 20s, and perhaps thinking they don't want to put a vaccine into their body. But it, gets me thinking how many players have painkilling jabs so often and, barely think about those. They will say, obviously, they've been around for many, many more years. And some are sort of thinking, well, these COVID jabs have only been around for a year or so. So they question that. Even those we know from the health authorities, they have gone through rigorous testing. We are assured that, they are safe. And, we've seen so many people around the world having them perfectly fine. And, perhaps we've not seen that leadership from FIFA, even though they are in partnership with the World Health Organization to promote a vaccine message, really until the last few days. And they've said they encourage players to get vaccinated. And on top of this, we're looking ahead to the 2022 World Cup, when we had thought they might have a mandatory vaccination policy, particularly for fans. Now it looks like they could relax that and allow, say, testing instead of just mandatory vaccines.
Do you sense frustration on the club officials' part when you're talking to them?
Yeah. I'm going to have to go off here. Someone has decided to interrupt me while on air to not letting me continue in the position I'm broadcasting from.
No problem. We appreciate you doing what you could for us. Thanks so much, Rob.
No problem. Okay. Thank you.
Cheers. Rob Harris there from Associated Press here on The Football Show, which, as ever, Not the Ball, is with thanks to Sky. All the football you love in one place across Sky Sports, BT Sport and Premier Sports. Back in a sec.